Before the roads forgot their dust and the banners forgot their names, there was a city that learned the art of waiting. It waited in marble and rain, in archways that never quite closed, in plazas where fountains rehearsed the first line of a song and then refused to sing the second. Wind crossed the avenues like a messenger too shy to deliver its letter. Every door was unlocked. No hand knew how to turn the handles. They called it the city that waited without footsteps. No maps marked it. No caravans claimed to have passed its gates. Those who found it were those who did not mean to, wanderers who had followed a memory too far and discovered it had built itself into stone. In the heart of the city, among colonnades veined with old thunder, lay a hall the color of late afternoon. It was the hall of paused crowns. There, on a dais of sleeping ironwood, a crown rested, antlers of hammered dusk braided with river gold, a small moon caught in metalwork. Beneath it, a figure reclined on a bier of shadow and silk, not dead, not alive, not undecided. The king who had been forgotten. He was covered to the throat with a mantle of twilight feathers. His face might once have ruled the horizon. Now it was the shape of a story no mouth could finish. Beside him, a chair waited with the patience of a mountain. On the chair lay a book with no pages. When opened, it played the scent of rain on hot stone and the sound of hooves that never arrived. A girl entered the hall at dusk. She wore no crown and carried no lamp. In her hand was a thread the color of first dawn. Its end knotted around her finger. Its origin vanished into the city as a river vanishes into salt. Her name was Mira, the name the sea gives to empty harbors when it is trying not to be cruel. Mira did not kneel. She sat on the floor and listened to the silence until it grew brave enough to speak. "What are you waiting for?" she asked the crown. The crown did not answer with words. It answered with weight. The air leaned heavier upon her shoulders, then lighter, as if remembering that a head once held it without complaint. Mira nodded as if that were language. "I understand," she said. "A throne is only a question asked too loudly." Night gathered, patient as a physician. The stars were late. The moon sent a proxy, a pearl of cloud that shone from within. Mira placed the thread of dawn upon the bier's edge. It brightened the feathers. The feathers brightened the room. The room brightened her breath. "Wake," she whispered, but not to the king. To the city. Streets answered first. A set of stairs coughed gently, releasing the dust of a procession that had never occurred. A bridge remembered how to arch. A tower tried its height on and found it still fit. In kitchens, bowls rotated to face the east as if expecting bread. In courtyards, ivy traced the names of those who had not yet been born. Then the dais exhaled. The king did not stir, but the crown, as if noticing an old obligation, inclined a fraction toward the sleeping brow. Mira closed her eyes and began to speak the history that had not been written. She told of a boy who learned to count by counting the spaces between bells. Of a prince who measured decisions by the length of his sister's laughter. Of a ruler who gave away his armies to the wind and found that the wind returned them as songs. She told of a drought that ended when the king poured silence into the wells so that every bucket drew up echoes cool enough to drink. As she spoke, the book with no pages began to turn. It did not reveal words, but textures. The rough of a saddle used to ride toward forgiveness, the smooth of a banister caressed by 1,000 climbing hopes, the chill of a blade that chose not to be drawn. "You are not forgotten," Mira said to the man beneath the feathers. "You are only sleeping where memory cannot touch you without becoming fire." From the threshold came the soft knock of bare feet. An old woman entered, carrying a bowl of water so still the room could see itself in it. Her hair was the white of marble taught to be kind by centuries of rain. She set the bowl at the foot of the bier and dipped 2 fingers into its mirror. Ripples traveled like swans toward the crown and broke themselves against its dusk antlers. "Child," the woman said gently, "do you know what you keep in your hand?" Mira looked down at the thread of dawn. "It's a promise," she said. "It is the last thread of mourning the city saved on the day the sun didn't arrive," the woman replied. "We kept it for when the king grew too heavy for the night to carry." "Is he heavy?" "All kings are heavy," said the woman. "Even the ones who refused to be. They kept vigil." Mira told stories that had never happened but should have. The old woman offered the water to shadows until the shadows remembered they were merely exhausted light. The crown listened. There are weights a head cannot bear without breaking, but a story can. So Mira wove the weight into a tapestry of unremembered triumphs. A treaty signed in the handwriting of rain, a famine fed by orchards that learned to dream fruit, a battle surrendered to the future until the future had time to forgive. With each tale, feathers loosened into breath. The king's lips parted as if considering a word. The crown leaned closer, as if its hunger were not for power, but for the warmth of a human brow. "Why did he sleep?" Mira asked at last. The old woman washed the question in the bowl before answering. "Because he chose to be a question instead of an answer. Because answers end. Because every crown eats a little of the head that wears it, and he loved the city too much to feed it his mind." Mira shivered. She remembered doors that had refused to close because to close is to declare a night finished. She remembered a child counting the spaces between bells. She wondered whether a city could love a king enough to let him remain a question. The moon arrived in person, pale and understanding. It poured itself through the high windows and came to rest in the bowl of water, which accepted it like a small, perfect grief. With moon and water and the thread of dawn, the hall learned 3 kinds of light at once. The light that nurses sleep, the light that forgives shadows for trying, and the light that insists that morning exists even when it does not. Mira rose. She lifted the crown, slowly, with both hands, as one lifts a sleeping bird impressed with the idea of sky. It was heavier than kingdoms and lighter than a mother's sigh. She hovered it above the king's brow. "Not to bind," she whispered. "To remember." She set the crown down, not on his head, but around the bowl where the moon swam. Feather by feather, the mantle thinned to dawn. The king opened his eyes. He did not sit up. He did not speak. His gaze traveled the room the way rain travels a field, blessing everything by merely arriving. He looked at the woman. She nodded as if the final bead of a long abacus had fallen into its place. He looked at Mira. The thread of dawn burned brighter, then relaxed, its work done. The king raised one hand, palm forward. The ancient gesture of a traveler asking a gate not whether it is open, but whether it is tired. Mira understood. She lifted the crown from the moonlit bowl. Water clung to its antlers like 1,000 unshed heralds. She held it toward him. He did not take it. Instead, he breathed deep, unafraid, the kind of breath that teaches rooms how to be rooms. The crown warmed. The water stilled. Outside, stairs remembered their first footsteps.
"Will you wear it?" Mira asked, not as a subject but as a witness. The king looked at the city through the high windows where the night practiced turning into itself. His voice, when it arrived, was the sound of a door discovering that it had never been locked. "I will wear it," he said, "only when the city forgets how to carry its own dawn. Then what will the crown be until then?" He smiled the small, tired smile of someone who has returned from an absence without a map. "A bowl for the moon, a ring for the well, a circle where children count the spaces between bells." Mira set the crown back around the bowl. The moon breathed. The city exhaled the century it had been holding. In streets that had waited without footsteps, steps began. The king closed his eyes again, not to sleep, but to let the city look at itself without the distraction of a gaze too loved to resist. The old woman gathered the thread of dawn and wound it into a coil for the mornings to come. Mira walked out into the corridor. The columns seemed lighter, the rain less lonely. She knew now that some kings rule by wearing crowns. Others rule by teaching a city how to carry one together. She smiled up at the moon, which was busy pretending it had done nothing at all. The city had begun to move, yet the air still carried the sound of waiting. Streets exhaled gently, releasing the dust of centuries that had clung to their lungs. Windows blinked open, shy after so much stillness. Every step Mira took felt like an invitation answered too slowly. The moon still hovered above the Hall of Crowns, watching with the patience of stone. And somewhere beneath its silver gaze, the king dreamed without sleeping. Mira followed a path she did not remember choosing. It led her through a long corridor lined with mirrors that did not reflect. Each one was filled instead with shadows of people who had never walked there, the unworn footsteps of the city's past.
When she paused, the shadows paused with her. When she breathed, they listened as if trying to learn the shape of her breath. "Who are you?" she whispered, and in the mirror nearest to her, a child's voice replied, "We are the steps he didn't take." At the corridor's end stood a gate of transparent stone that seemed to pulse with the heartbeat of the city. Behind it, a room glowed with amber light, not from torches, but from the heat of remembered sunrises. In its center lay a second crown. It was smaller than the one the king had left behind, woven from copper and ashes instead of gold and dusk. Its shape was broken in two, its missing half carved into the air itself, as though the rest of it had chosen to become breath. The mirrors behind her whispered in unison, "This is the crown of footsteps, the one that walks without being worn." Mira reached for it, but her hand stopped halfway. The air was heavy, not with danger, but with memory too fragile to touch. She saw the shadow of the king walk past her, younger than when he slept. He did not see her. He was lost in his own decision. He walked down the corridor, each footstep echoing into the mirrors until they filled with versions of him that would never exist. When he reached the gate, he paused, turned to his own reflection, and said, "I will leave my steps behind so the city can learn how to walk without me." Then he removed the crown of copper and set it in the light where Mira now stood. The mirrors shimmered with his departure. One by one, the unworn footsteps began to fade, not erased, but absorbed into the stone beneath her feet. The city was reclaiming its motion. Mira picked up the half-crown and held it to the light. It was warm as breath and soft as forgiveness. When she pressed it to her forehead, she felt neither royalty nor power, only a quiet understanding. The forgotten king had never left. He had simply taught the city to remember itself by standing still.
The mirrors darkened until they reflected only her and the light behind her. The corridor was no longer a hallway, but a bridge between past and beginning. She turned and walked back toward the Hall of Crowns. The sound of her steps was new, light, certain, real. Outside, the first birds of morning began to sing, and somewhere beyond stone and time, the king smiled in his sleep. When Mira returned to the Hall of Crowns, dawn had begun to pool along the windowsills. The air was pale, delicate, full of beginnings too shy to announce themselves. The king still slept, though his breathing had changed. It came now like waves upon a gentle shore, steady, forgiving. At his side lay the bowl where the moon had rested. Its water shimmered with faint ripples, though nothing had disturbed it. Each ripple hummed with soundless tone, as if the hall itself were exhaling music. Mira placed the half-crown of copper beside the bowl. The water brightened, echoing back her reflection. Then another. Not her face, but her voice. Spoke softly. Echo is not repetition. It is the memory of something still trying to reach itself. She turned, startled. Crony, the old woman's brother, had entered. His robes were the color of old parchment, his eyes like hours that had forgotten to pass. The crown of echoes, he said, nodding toward the bowl, is born each time the world listens too closely to its own heart. He lifted the half-crown. When he turned it in the light, it shimmered as if remembering every voice that had ever touched stone. Before he slept, Crony continued, the king built a chamber beneath the city, a place where all words that were ever spoken in kindness could live without fading. He called it the Choir of Forgotten Light. Mira listened. In the distance, faint songs began to rise, low and human, though no throats had made them. They came from beneath the floor, from the stones themselves.
Crony led her downward through spiral stairs that curved like shells. The air grew warm, scented with old rain and candle smoke. At the bottom waited a vast room filled with threads of gold thousands, hanging from the ceiling, trembling with sound. Each thread was a voice. When Mira passed by, one began to hum, the sound of her own laughter as a child. Another sang a lullaby her mother had never finished. Another whispered her name the way the sea did when it was lonely. Crony smiled. Every kindness ever spoken has weight. The king feared that when men stopped speaking gently, the world would forget how to hold itself together. So he hid their echoes here. In the center of the chamber stood the rest of the crown, the missing half of copper, gleaming faintly beneath the threads. Mira approached. As she neared, the threads bent toward her, brushing her shoulders like rain. When she joined the two halves, the chamber stilled. Every echo, every kindness, every memory, inhaled. Then the crown sang. Its song was not melody but warmth, the feeling of a hand offered without demand, of forgiveness unspoken yet understood, of time pausing long enough to let the world breathe. When silence returned, Mira felt tears on her cheeks. Not sorrow, but awe. Crony took the crown gently from her hands and placed it on the water's surface. It did not sink. It floated, a ring of light, humming softly like the edge of a dream. The city will awaken soon, he said. And when it does, it will need its echoes not to remember words, but to remember why words were ever needed. Mira looked once more at the sleeping king. The corners of his mouth curved in quiet joy, as though hearing the song from a distance.
She smiled. The king doesn't rule the city anymore, she whispered. Crony shook his head. No, the city rules itself now, through what it chooses to remember. Outside, the first real morning light touched the rooftops. It was warm enough to sound like music. The morning had deepened. The city of waiting was no longer still, but neither was it alive in the way ordinary places live. It moved like a dream retelling itself. Bells rang softly without being struck. Markets unfolded their tents with no hands to raise them. Pigeons returned to their towers as though drawn by memories of flight. Yet, above all this, a hush held dominion, a silence so vast that even the sun hesitated to rise fully into it. It was not the silence of absence, but the silence of listening. Mira followed Crony through a passage carved beneath the Hall of Crowns. The walls were etched with words in languages no one spoke anymore. Each phrase shimmered faintly, as though longing to be read aloud one last time. At the end of the corridor stood a chamber with no door, only a threshold made of light. Crony stopped. "This is as far as I go," he said. "Beyond this place, silence speaks for itself." Mira stepped forward, her heart steady as a clock that had learned mercy. Inside was a vast hall filled with stillness so deep it had texture. The walls pulsed faintly with a light that came from nowhere and everywhere. In the center stood a throne carved from the bones of mountains, smooth, worn, eternal. Upon it sat no king, only the echo of a presence, a shimmer of air shaped like remembrance. Mira felt her breath slow. Every sound she made, the rustle of cloth, the beat of her heart, entered the air and became something visible, curling like smoke. Each movement became an offering.
Then the air shifted. From the throne's base rose faint outlines, forms of people kneeling, turning, waiting. Not ghosts, but the city's memories. They were every prayer ever whispered to the king after he fell asleep. A child who had begged for courage before her first day of labor. A mother who had prayed for rain and received it in tears instead. A mason who had sung to the stones to keep them from cracking. They bowed not to rule, but to gratitude. Mira approached the throne and placed her hand upon it. It was warm, impossibly so, the warmth of patience, of time choosing not to rush. "You are not empty," she whispered. "You are waiting for words that deserve to return." Her voice faded. In the silence that followed, something answered, not with sound, but with vibration. The throne began to hum faintly, like the earth remembering its own heartbeat. Then she heard the king's voice, not from the air, but from within her. "The throne is not meant for a ruler. It is meant for a listener." The chamber trembled. From the cracks in the stone, light poured upward, not bright, but soft, forgiving. Every word ever spoken in the city gathered in that light, freed from meaning, reduced to pure intention. Mira felt them brush against her skin. Love, regret, promise, hope, all stripped of shape, glowing like petals on unseen water. The king appeared before her, still crowned by sleep, his face serene. He looked upon the throne and smiled. "It no longer needs me," he said. "You taught the city to carry silence as I once carried dawn." He turned to her. "Sit." Mira hesitated. "I am not a queen," she said. He shook his head. "No one who sits here ever is." She stepped forward and sat upon the throne of silence. It did not feel like power. It felt like stillness remembering itself. The king placed his hand over hers, briefly, tenderly, then faded into the same light that had once crowned him. The chamber grew brighter, not with brilliance, but with peace. When Mira rose, the throne remained, pulsing softly like a heart left behind by eternity. The silence that followed her out was not emptiness. It was music waiting to be born. She returned to the city. People had begun to move again, speaking gently, as though remembering that words were sacred tools, not weapons. The old woman met her at the steps. "Did he speak?" she asked. Mira nodded. "He said silence was the first crown." The woman smiled. "Then the kingdom has woken." When Mira stepped beyond the chamber of silence, the air changed. It smelled of rain before it falls, of waiting. The corridor descended into the earth, its walls carved with shapes that shimmered like reflections.
Each carving showed a crown submerged in waves, each wave shaped like a sleeping face. Crony's voice echoed faintly from behind her. The throne stands upon the river that dreams of the world. When it dries, time ends. At the passage's end lay an opening like a wound in the world. There was no floor, only water. Dark, bottomless, slow. It whispered rather than flowed. She knelt and touched it. The surface gave way like breath, and in that touch she saw visions. Cities blooming and fading, kings waking and falling, voices rising like foam and dissolving into the deep. The river carried every story ever forgotten. Something glowed within the depths, a light that pulsed with rhythm, like a sleeping heart. It was the heart of the crown, the oldest relic of the city, the first spark the gods had given to humankind. She leaned closer. The water trembled, showing her reflection, but older, wiser, crowned in stars. Then the king's voice surrounded her once more. All thrones sit upon water, for power must learn to yield. Even eternity must move, or it ceases to be.
Mira stepped into the river. It did not drown her. It carried her, gently weightless, through a corridor of light. All around her, shapes drifted, forgotten dreams, prayers that never reached their gods, songs left unsung. They brushed her arms like fish made of memory. The deeper she went, the brighter the current became, until it glowed gold like sunrise beneath glass. At the river's heart, a vast clock of light hung suspended, half submerged. The hands did not move. Each mark upon its face was an era, a heartbeat of creation paused in reverence. Mira understood. This was where time rested when the gods slept. The river was their dream, and the city above its echo. She placed her palms upon the clock's surface. Ripples spread, ringing like bells across the unseen horizon. Time inhaled. The king appeared again beside her, formed of mist and radiance. His eyes were calm, endless. "You have woken the river," he said. "It will carry the city into its next dawn. But you, Mira, you must choose whether to return with it or remain as its guardian." She hesitated. To stay was to vanish. To return was to forget. Mira smiled faintly. "I will walk until the water forgets my name, and remember it only when the world is kind again." The king bowed. He reached into the water and drew forth a single drop that glowed like amber. He pressed it to her forehead. "Then you are the river now." The vision dissolved. When she opened her eyes, she stood once more beneath the throne. The water murmured quietly beneath the stone, alive again. Above her, the crown upon the surface shone like a second sun. When Mira returned to the city, she found its streets bright with rain. People laughed softly as if they remembered why sound was beautiful. The old woman met her once more at the steps of the hall. "Did the king wake?" she asked. Mira shook her head. "No, but the world did." She turned toward the horizon, where rivers glimmered like veins of light running through the land. In their reflection, her eyes shone with quiet infinity, and beneath it all, the faintest hum, the pulse of time itself, continued. The rain had passed. Morning spread over the city like a slow exhalation. Soft light through mist, glimmering rooftops, a peace that hummed beneath the stones. The Hall of Crowns stood open. Its doors, long shut, now shimmered as if made of dawn itself. No one had opened them, and yet they had chosen to yield. Inside, the throne stood empty. Upon it rested the crown, glowing faintly, alive with memory. It pulsed like a heartbeat, echoing the rhythm of distant tides. Mira entered quietly, her footsteps dissolving before they met the floor. The old woman and crony followed her, their faces lit by reverence, not fear.
"The king sleeps no longer," said Crony. "But neither has he risen. He has become the dream itself." Mira approached the throne. The air around it shimmered, bending light into gentle halos. Within those halos, she saw faces, the faces of everyone the city had ever loved. When she touched the crown, it was neither metal nor light. It was warmth, memory, and promise woven together. It whispered not in words, but in feeling. You kept the silence alive. The king's voice was there, everywhere. In the light, in the air, in her pulse. Every ruler must sleep, so that the world may wake. The crown rose gently from her hands, hovering between them. Then, slowly, it dissolved into 1,000 small lights that floated outward, into the city, the clouds, the river, and beyond. Outside, the people felt it. They looked up as warmth touched their foreheads, like sunlight passing through dreams. Each person saw a brief vision, a memory of kindness they had forgotten they gave. A baker recalled sharing his last loaf. A child remembered holding her mother's trembling hand.
A soldier remembered sparing an enemy and calling him brother. Every act, no matter how small, became part of the new light that filled the air. Crony wept. "It is done," he whispered. "The crown has awakened." The old woman smiled through tears. "The king is everywhere now, in every mercy, in every silence that listens before it speaks." Mira nodded. The kingdom no longer needs a throne. It remembers itself. She stepped outside. The sky had cleared completely. The rain washed into rivers that glowed like threads of silver, weaving the city together. Each shimmer was alive, the heartbeat of time restored. As the sun rose, Mira walked to the river's edge. The reflection staring back was her own, but not entirely. A faint glimmer of a crown traced her silhouette. She knelt and whispered, "Rest well, my king. The world remembers." The water shimmered once, and then stilled. From far above, bells began to toll. Not in mourning, but in harmony. Each tone rippled outward like wings unfolding across eternity. The dream had become the world a song, and the crown, not a symbol of rule, but of remembrance. That night, when the stars returned, they seemed closer than before. Some said they saw the king's face in them. Others swore they heard Myra's voice carried on the wind, gentle, steady, timeless. The truth was simpler. Every whisper, every kindness, every dream that chose to live, was now a fragment of the forgotten king's endless light. End of Part 6, The Awakening of the Crown. End of the dream of the forgotten king, the crown that slept. Thank you for listening to Sleep with Myth.